December 7th, 1941. Ota District, Tokyo, Japan. Through his office window, Admiral Yamamoto could see the imperial palace grounds bathed in morning light. Celebrations erupted in the streets below as news of the Pearl Harbor attack spread through the capital. In the past 12 hours, Japanese carrier planes had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 2,400 Americans dead, 350 aircraft destroyed. The attack had been a tactical masterpiece. Japanese naval aviators had achieved complete surprise, executing their mission with extraordinary skill and courage. Yet Yamamoto sat alone in his office, consumed by dread rather than triumph. While military leaders and government officials celebrated what they believed was a decisive blow against American naval power, Yamamoto understood a truth that would haunt him until his death. This attack, which seemed like Japan's greatest victory, would prove to be the catalyst for Japan's inevitable defeat. He had spent years in America, more time than any senior Japanese military officer of his generation. He had walked through the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where blast furnaces produced more steel in a single day than some Japanese mills produced in a month. He had driven past the endless automobile factories of Detroit, witnessing assembly lines that churned out vehicles with mechanical precision that Japanese industry could not match. He had seen the agricultural abundance of California's Central Valley, where farms produced food surpluses that fed millions while Japanese agriculture struggled to feed its own population. He knew what his fellow officers refused to believe. America possessed industrial capacity that defied Japanese comprehension. The mathematics of war that his colleagues celebrated would soon become the mathematics of Japan's doom. What none of them understood, what they could not accept even when confronted with evidence, was that this attack would trigger the most rapid industrial mobilization in human history. A transformation so complete that within 6 months, American production would shatter every assumption Japanese war planners had made about their enemy's capabilities. The sleeping giant metaphor that would later become associated with this moment was apocryphal, but the sentiment was real. America, once aroused to fury, would prove unstoppable. The collapse of Japanese strategic assumptions began not with a military defeat, but with a single presidential speech. January 6, 1942, 30 days after Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver his State of the Union address. He announced production goals that Japanese intelligence officers monitoring the speech would later dismiss as propaganda, impossible targets designed purely for American morale. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 more in 1943, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942, 35,000 in 1943, 6 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million tons in 1943. These were not single-year goals as Japanese analysts initially interpreted them. Roosevelt was announcing a 2-year production program, but even understood correctly, the targets seemed fantastical. To put these numbers in context, Japan had produced approximately 5,000 aircraft in 1941. America had built approximately 19,000 military aircraft that same year, nearly 4 times Japanese output even before mobilization began. The gap was already substantial, but Roosevelt was demanding production increases that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. Consider the mathematics. Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 12 times what Japan had produced in 1941, and more than 3 times what America itself had built. The entire Japanese aircraft industry, operating at maximum capacity with every factory running multiple shifts, produced roughly the same output as a single American state. Japanese military planners simply could not conceive of industrial capacity on the scale Roosevelt was describing. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this possibility. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, he had held a secret conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. The exact timing of this meeting remains disputed by historians, with sources citing dates ranging from early 1940 to November 1941, but the substance of Yamamoto's warning is well documented. If we are ordered to do it, I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. The Admiralty had ignored his warning. The Army General Staff had dismissed his caution as weakness, as defeatism unsuitable for a warrior. They believed American society was too soft, too divided, too decadent to mobilize for total war. They pointed to American isolationism, labor disputes, racial tensions, and political divisions as evidence that America lacked the unity and discipline necessary for modern warfare. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the American industrial machine began a transformation that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare and establish new standards for national mobilization. The War Production Board was established on January 16, 1942, exactly 40 days after the attack. Chairman Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive with no military experience, received authority unprecedented in American peacetime history. He could commandeer factories, redirect raw materials, set production quotas, transform entire industries overnight. His power, derived from the War Powers Act, was nearly absolute in matters of industrial production. The speed of conversion stunned even American observers who understood their nation's industrial capacity. General Motors, the world's largest automobile manufacturer and a corporate giant that epitomized American industrial prowess, produced its last civilian car on February 10, 1942. 64 days after Pearl Harbor, the vehicle, a Chevrolet sedan, rolled off the assembly line at noon. By midnight, the same assembly line was being reconfigured for tank production. By March 1st, the massive Willow Run plant outside Detroit, purpose-built by Ford to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers, had begun production. The plant was so large that it had its own railway system, its own power plant, and its own fire department. At peak production, Willow Run produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, every major automobile manufacturer in America ceased civilian production entirely. These factories, which had produced 4.5 million cars in 1941, feeding America's appetite for personal transportation and symbolizing the American way of life, would produce exactly 0 civilian vehicles for the duration of the war. Instead, they built tanks, aircraft engines, artillery shells, machine guns, and military vehicles in quantities that Japanese planners had calculated were mathematically impossible given America's pre-war industrial base. The automobile industry's conversion provides a window into American industrial flexibility. A factory that had built car engines could, with relatively minor retooling, build aircraft engines. Workers who had assembled transmissions could learn to assemble tank drivetrains. The fundamental industrial infrastructure, the machine tools, the trained workforce, the management systems, the supply chains could be redirected toward military production with stunning speed. Japan possessed no equivalent flexibility. Japanese military production existed in dedicated facilities that could not easily be converted or expanded. When a Japanese aircraft factory was damaged by bombing, it could not be quickly rebuilt or replaced. When American factories were operating at capacity, new factories were built in months. The scale of American production began overwhelming Japanese expectations almost immediately. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 military aircraft, falling short of Roosevelt's ambitious goal of 60,000 but still nearly 10 times Japan's annual output of approximately 5,000. By 1943, production reached 85,000 aircraft, missing Roosevelt's target of 125,000 but still representing more aircraft than existed in the entire world just a decade earlier. These were not just fighters and bombers. They included transport aircraft, reconnaissance planes, trainer aircraft, gliders, and specialized types that Japan was not producing in any significant numbers. By 1944, American aircraft production peaked at 96,000 units. By war's end in 1945, cumulative American production reached 297,000 military aircraft. Japan, mobilizing its entire industrial base for war production and accepting drastic civilian privation, built 85,611 aircraft during the entire war from 1941 to 1945. The American to Japanese production ratio was more than 3-to-1, sustained across 4 years of maximum effort by both nations. The disparity was not merely quantitative. It was categorical, representing fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. America was fighting a war of material abundance, accepting that some aircraft would be lost to accidents, mechanical failures, or enemy action, but knowing they could be replaced faster than they were destroyed. Japan was fighting a war of scarcity, carefully husbanding resources, unable to replace losses, watching their numerical strength decline month by month regardless of tactical victories achieved. But the transformation went far beyond simple numbers on production charts. It represented a fundamental reorganization of American society that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. Boeing's Seattle plant provides an illustrative example. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the facility employed 4,000 workers producing aircraft at a modest pace. By the war's peak, the plant employed 30,000 workers, operating 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The workforce had increased 7-fold in less than 3 years. Similar expansions occurred at every major defense contractor across America. Where did these workers come from? From every segment of American society. Women, who had comprised less than 1% of aircraft industry workers before the war, made up over 10% by mid-1942. By March 1943, women comprised 30% of aviation manufacturing employees. By 1945, women made up 65% of the aircraft industry workforce in some facilities. The iconic Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda. She was economic reality, representing millions of women who left homes and entered factories to support the war effort. These women were not merely supplemental labor filling clerical roles or light assembly work. They were primary workers performing every task previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages, riveted wing sections, assembled complex engines, operated heavy machinery, read blueprints, performed quality control inspections. They worked swing shifts and graveyard shifts. They raised children, managed households, and worked 48-hour weeks in defense plants. Without them, American production goals would have been impossible to achieve. African Americans, systematically excluded from skilled industrial work in peacetime America through both formal discrimination and informal barriers, found new employment opportunities in defense plants. Executive Order 8802, signed by Roosevelt in June 1941, prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. While discrimination certainly continued in practice, the manpower demands of total war forced American industry to tap labor pools previously excluded. By 1945, over 1 million African Americans worked in defense industries, gaining skills, earning wages, and developing expectations of equality that would fuel the post-war civil rights movement. Teenagers left high schools to work in factories, with special programs allowing students to work half-days while continuing education. The elderly came out of retirement, bringing experience and work ethic to factories desperate for skilled labor. Disabled individuals found employment in positions suited to their capabilities. The massive labor mobilization drew upon every available person in American society. By 1944, over 18 million Americans worked in defense-related industries, nearly 1 in 7 people in the entire nation. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial capacity and innovative manufacturing approaches. These cargo vessels, designed to be built quickly with semi-skilled labor using standardized components, began rolling off production lines at unprecedented rates. The most famous example was the SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. This record was deliberately set as an incentive demonstration, with experienced workers, stockpiled materials, and special preparations. It was far faster than normal construction times, which averaged 42 to 50 days per ship. But even the normal pace was remarkable by historical standards. Ships that previously took months to build were being launched in weeks. At peak production in 1943, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships per day, 18 merchant vessels per week, 75 per month. By war's end, America would produce 2,710 Liberty ships, each one carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, together representing more shipping capacity than existed in the entire Japanese merchant marine at the war's start. Japan's entire merchant ship construction program, operating at maximum wartime capacity, produced approximately 15 ships per month at peak. The disparity was overwhelming and strategically decisive. Consider the strategic implications of this shipping disparity. America could sustain military operations across 2 oceans, simultaneously supplying forces in Europe and the Pacific, maintaining civilian prosperity at home, and sending massive aid to allies including Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Japan could barely maintain supply lines to its own frontline forces and saw its merchant marine systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to approximately 10% of its pre-war tonnage, strangling Japanese industry of raw materials and military forces of supplies. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory became clear to any analyst willing to examine production statistics objectively. But Japanese military leadership refused to acknowledge reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, wrote in his diary in March 1942, "Barely 3 months into the war, we achieved tactical surprise, but I fear we have guaranteed strategic defeat. The Americans are not collapsing as we predicted. They are building. They are angry. They are unified." His concerns were noted by superiors, and Genda was quietly removed from strategic planning duties. The military leadership did not want officers who questioned inevitable victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea, in May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the first significant check to Japanese expansion. For the first time since the war began, a Japanese invasion force was turned back without achieving its objectives. The Imperial Japanese Navy had planned to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, establishing air bases within striking distance of Australia and completing Japan's defensive perimeter. American and Australian naval forces intercepted the invasion fleet, leading to history's first aircraft carrier battle, where opposing ships never came within visual range of each other. The tactical results were roughly even. The light carrier Shoho was sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was badly damaged. The American carrier Lexington was sunk, and Yorktown was damaged. But the strategic implications favored America. More significantly than ship losses, the Japanese lost 90 aircraft and 77 pilots. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, these pilot losses were catastrophic. Japanese naval aviation training programs were lengthy, demanding, and produced relatively few graduates. Replacing 77 experienced pilots required a year or more, assuming training facilities and fuel were available, which they increasingly were not. These losses, which would have been acceptable attrition rates in a war against an equal power, were unsustainable against American production capacity. While Japan struggled to build replacement aircraft, train new pilots, and repair damaged carriers, American factories and flight schools operated 24 hours a day. New American pilots were completing training every week. New American aircraft were rolling off assembly lines every hour. The attrition equation favored America overwhelmingly. Then came Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, precisely as Admiral Yamamoto had predicted. The battle would prove the turning point of the Pacific War, not because of American tactical superiority, which was questionable, but because it revealed the strategic vulnerability that American production capacity would exploit relentlessly for the next 3 years. Admiral Yamamoto had committed 4 fleet carriers to the Midway operation, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These vessels represented the core of Japanese naval air power, the same carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the most experienced in the world, veterans of operations in China, Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. They had trained together for years, achieving levels of coordination and skill that American aviators, many with only months of training, could not match. Japanese naval aviation was, plane for plane and pilot for pilot, superior to anything America could field in mid-1942. None of this mattered when American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at the critical moment. American codebreakers, operating from a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, had cracked Japanese naval codes and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with remarkably detailed information about Japanese plans. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in ambush positions northeast of Midway Island. The Japanese, expecting surprise, sailed into a trap. The battle itself was decided in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, arriving over the Japanese carriers by chance rather than coordination, found 3 carriers with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft being prepared for strikes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by multiple bombs and transformed into infernos within minutes. Fuel lines ruptured. Bomb magazines exploded. Armed aircraft on deck detonated. The carriers, which had been Japan's premier naval assets hours earlier, became flaming wrecks that had to be scuttled. Hiryu, operating separately, launched a counterattack that crippled the American carrier Yorktown, but was itself discovered and destroyed later that day. In a single day of combat, Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and between 248 and 320 aircraft, depending on how losses are calculated. 110 pilots died, representing just under 25% of the total aircrew embarked on the 4 carriers. These pilots were irreplaceable. Their experience, their training, their institutional knowledge was lost permanently. American losses were significant. The carrier Yorktown was sunk by a Japanese submarine days after the battle. The destroyer Hamon, alongside Yorktown providing damage control assistance, was also sunk. 307 American servicemen died. But the strategic mathematics were what mattered. America lost 1 carrier, Japan lost 4. America could replace carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. Japan could not replace either carriers or pilots at rates necessary to sustain attrition warfare. The implications were catastrophic for Japanese strategy and became clearer with each passing month. In the 3 years following Midway, from June 1942 to June 1945, Japan would complete 6 new carriers. America would complete 17 Essex-class carriers during the same period, each one larger, faster, and more capable than its Japanese counterparts. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 33,000 tons, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and incorporated damage control features that made them extraordinarily difficult to sink. They were marvels of naval architecture and industrial production, but carrier production was only one measure of the industrial disparity that Midway had revealed. American shipyards, aircraft factories, pilot training programs, and every other element of naval aviation were scaling up exponentially, while Japanese capacity remained essentially static or actually declined, as resources became scarce and factories were damaged by bombing. The mathematical inevitability of Japanese defeat became clearer with each month's production figures. Consider the aircraft production comparison in detail. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, Japan had produced approximately 5,000 aircraft, while America built approximately 19,000, a ratio of nearly 4-to-1 favoring America. In 1942, American production reached 47,000, while Japan managed approximately 20,000, widening the gap to more than 2-to-1. In 1943, America produced 85,000 aircraft, while Japan built approximately 28,000, a ratio of 3-to-1. The gap continued widening throughout the war. By war's end, America had produced 297,000 military aircraft total. Japan had built 85,611 aircraft during the entire war from 1937 through 1945, if you include pre-Pearl Harbor production. The cumulative ratio was more than 3-to-1, sustained across years of maximum mobilization by both nations. But simple ratios understate the disparity because American aircraft were, on average, larger, more complex, longer-ranged, and more heavily armed than Japanese aircraft. A B-29 Superfortress represented far more industrial capacity than a Zero fighter, yet both count as single aircraft in production statistics. The disparity extended to every category of war production, revealing systematic American industrial dominance across all measures. Tanks provide perhaps the starkest comparison. America produced 86,000 tanks during World War II, including 33,000 Sherman medium tanks, the primary American armored vehicle in both Europe and the Pacific. Japan produced approximately 6,500 tanks over the same period, and most of these were light tanks weighing less than 20 tons, unsuitable for combat against American mediums weighing 30 tons. The Type 97 Chiha, Japan's most numerous medium tank, weighed 15 tons, carried a 57mm gun, and had armor protection of only 25mm at maximum thickness. The Sherman, in contrast, weighed 30 tons, mounted a 75mm gun, and had 50mm frontal armor. In any engagement between these vehicles, the Sherman had overwhelming advantages in firepower, protection, and mobility. But even if Japanese tanks had been technically equal, which they were not, the numerical disparity of 13-to-1 meant that Japanese armor was effectively irrelevant in the Pacific theater. American tanks could be deployed in overwhelming numbers, ensuring victory through sheer quantity, even when qualitative differences favored Japan. American factories built 2 million military trucks during the war. Japan manufactured approximately 165,000 trucks. The ratio of more than 12-to-1 reflects fundamentally different approaches to military logistics. American forces were highly mobile, with infantry divisions possessing thousands of trucks for transport and supply. Japanese forces relied heavily on railroads, coastal shipping, and human porters for logistics. When American forces cut Japanese supply lines, Japanese troops often found themselves immobilized and starving. American forces, with abundant trucks and well-organized supply chains, maintained operational tempo and combat effectiveness, even in remote locations. American shipyards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels during the war, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels. Japan completed fewer than 1,000 naval vessels. The disparity was overwhelming in every category. America built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers after Midway. America built over 400 destroyer escorts for convoy protection. Japan built fewer than 70 escort vessels. America launched approximately 200 submarines. Japan built approximately 170, but American submarines proved far more effective in commerce raiding and ultimately destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. The submarine war in the Pacific demonstrates how industrial capacity translated directly into strategic results. American submarines, operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later the Philippines, systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 60% of all Japanese merchant vessels and 30% of the Japanese Navy. This maritime blockade starved Japanese industry of oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines, and food from throughout the empire. Japan's war economy collapsed, not from lack of will, but from lack of raw materials that could no longer be transported safely. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, less than 10% remained operational. Japan could not replace these losses because shipyards were operating at reduced capacity due to material shortages and bomb damage. America was building merchant ships faster than Japanese submarines could possibly sink them, and Japanese submarines focused on warships rather than merchant vessels anyway, a strategic mistake that squandered one of Japan's few potentially effective weapons. But raw numbers only partially explain the industrial chasm that separated the combatants. American production was not merely larger in scale, it was fundamentally different in character, representing a level of industrial integration, technological sophistication, and organizational efficiency that Japan could not match with available resources and technology. The B-29 Superfortress bomber exemplifies this difference better than any other single weapons system. The B-29 was designed specifically to strike Japan from distant bases, addressing the strategic problem of how to attack Japanese home islands when carriers could not safely operate in range and island bases were not yet available. Boeing designed the aircraft to carry heavy bomb loads across 3,000-mile distances at altitudes above 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively operate. The resulting aircraft was the most complex bomber of World War II and possibly the most sophisticated production aircraft built by any nation during the war. Each B-29 contained 40,540 different parts, from massive engine components to tiny electrical switches. The aircraft consumed 12 tons of aluminum in its construction, along with substantial quantities of copper, steel, rubber, and exotic materials like magnesium that Japan could barely obtain. 4 Wright R3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, powered the bomber to operating speeds of 350 miles per hour at 30,000 feet altitude. The pressurized cabin allowed crew members to operate in normal clothing rather than bulky heated flight suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets, aimed by sophisticated analog computers, provided defensive armament. The B-29 carried up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, equivalent to the total bomb load of 20 fighters, across distances of 3,000 miles. It struck targets that had previously been safe from air attack, bringing war directly to Japanese cities and industry. America would build approximately 4,000 of these bombers between 1943 and 1945. Each one represented industrial capacity and technological sophistication that exceeded Japan's entire aircraft industry output. The fact that America could produce 4,000 B-29s while simultaneously building thousands of fighters, medium bombers, transports, and other aircraft types reveals the scale of American industrial mobilization. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated both American production capacity and the futility of Japanese resistance once American industry reached full mobilization. The campaign began in earnest in November 1944, when B-29 bombers based in the Mariana Islands began regular attacks on Japanese industrial targets. Initial raids used high-altitude precision bombing, attempting to destroy specific factories. Results were disappointing due to weather, navigation difficulties, and Japan's dispersed industrial base. In March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay changed tactics, ordering low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids against Japanese cities. The results were devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, employed 334 B-29 bombers, carrying 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs designed to start uncontrollable fires in densely packed wooden structures. The attack created a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more casualties than would result from the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The firestorm created temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water in canals and melt glass. People who sought refuge in water were boiled alive. Those who remained in buildings were incinerated. Those who fled into streets were suffocated by smoke or consumed by fire. The destruction was comprehensive and horrifying, exceeding anything that conventional bombing had previously achieved. Yet this massive raid, which killed more people than any other single air attack in history up to that point, represented only a fraction of American bombing capability. Within weeks, similar raids struck Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities throughout Japan. By summer 1945, Japan's major urban areas had been systematically destroyed. American bombers were dropping leaflets warning specific cities of impending attacks, then returning days later to destroy them exactly as promised. This psychological warfare demonstrated that Japan had lost not only the physical capacity to defend itself, but also the ability to protect civilians from assault. Japanese fighter defenses, already depleted by years of attrition, could not prevent American bombers from operating with near impunity over Japanese territory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, occurring exactly 2 years after Midway, demonstrated how completely American production had overcome Japanese tactical skill. The battle occurred during the American invasion of the Mariana Islands, strategically vital because their capture would place B-29 bombers within range of Japan. The Japanese Navy launched Operation Ago, committing 9 carriers and supporting vessels in an attempt to destroy American carrier forces and prevent the Marianas invasion. Japanese naval aviation, which had been the world's finest in 1941, had been systematically destroyed through 2 years of attrition warfare. Experienced pilots, killed in earlier battles, had been replaced by hastily trained recruits with minimal flight time and no combat experience. These new pilots, flying against American carrier groups that had expanded exponentially since Midway, were slaughtered in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft launched massive strikes against American carriers. American fighter defenses, guided by radar and coordinated by experienced fighter directors, intercepted Japanese formations. The result was catastrophic for Japan. More than 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire. American losses were approximately 30 aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 20-1, favoring America. For Japan, the loss of 600 aircraft in one day was catastrophic beyond imagination. American aircraft industry could replace 600 planes in less than a week of peak production. Japan required months to build that many aircraft, assuming materials and labor were available, which increasingly they were not. More critically, the pilots flying those aircraft were irreplaceable. Japan had no way to train hundreds of carrier pilots quickly. The few training facilities still operating lacked fuel, experienced instructors, and operational aircraft for student training. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a significant force. From that point forward, Japanese carriers operated without adequate aircraft or pilots. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys, carrying few aircraft and intended only to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches. The strategy failed, and Japanese naval power was effectively destroyed. By war's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed largely on paper, with surviving ships immobilized in harbors for lack of fuel. Women's role in American production deserves particular emphasis because it represented social mobilization that Japanese planners had not anticipated and could not replicate. In pre-war America, social conventions restricted women primarily to domestic roles or limited employment opportunities in teaching, nursing, secretarial work, and light manufacturing. Heavy industrial work was exclusively male domain. Defense industries employed virtually no women before 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. As millions of American men entered military service, defense industries faced critical labor shortages. The War Manpower Commission, established in April 1942, coordinated efforts to recruit women into defense work. The famous Rosie the Riveter recruitment campaign, featuring a determined woman with rolled-up sleeves declaring "We can do it," symbolized the national effort to recruit women into factories. The response was overwhelming. By 1943, over 6 million women worked in defense industries, comprising approximately 35% of the total defense workforce. In aircraft manufacturing, women made up 65% of workers in some facilities. These women performed every job previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages with acetylene torches, They operated massive hydraulic presses forming aluminum sheets. They assembled complex engines with thousands of precisely fitted parts. They read technical blueprints. They performed quality control inspections. They drove forklifts, operated cranes, worked on assembly lines, producing everything from bullets to battleships. The social implications were profound and lasting. Women who had never worked outside their homes discovered capabilities they had not known they possessed. They earned wages, gained economic independence, developed skills and confidence. After the war, many returned to domestic roles, but the experience fundamentally changed American society. The women who built B-29s and Liberty ships would raise daughters who demanded equality. The industrial mobilization of World War II planted seeds for the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. Japan had no equivalent mobilization of female labor. Japanese women certainly contributed to the war effort through agricultural work, light manufacturing, and civil defense, but Japanese industrial culture did not adapt to employ women in heavy manufacturing. This was partly cultural, reflecting traditional gender roles that were even more rigid than in pre-war America, but also practical. Japanese factories did not have labor surpluses to recruit from, because Japanese men were not being drafted in numbers comparable to American mobilization. Japan simply lacked the population base and industrial capacity to fight both a total war and maintain industrial production at levels comparable to America. The Manhattan Project represented the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific capacity, a program so vast and so secret that few Americans knew it existed, even as it employed over 130,000 people. The project cost approximately $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese defense budget for some years of the war. The facilities constructed for the Manhattan Project were themselves industrial marvels. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was built from scratch in 1943 as a uranium enrichment facility. At peak operation, the facility consumed 1/7 of all electrical power generated in the United States, more than New York City. The electromagnetic separation equipment, designed to separate fissionable uranium-235 from more common uranium-238, was manufactured by companies that normally produced commercial electrical equipment, but were converted to produce components for atomic weapons. Hanford, Washington, constructed simultaneously, produced plutonium in nuclear reactors that had never been operated at that scale before. The reactors required constant cooling with water from the Columbia River, processed in facilities that were the largest industrial installations in the Pacific Northwest. The entire operation was experimental, based on scientific principles that were barely understood and engineering on scales never attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico, served as the design laboratory where scientists and engineers designed the actual bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed a team of brilliant scientists, many refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, working frantically to complete weapons before Germany developed them first. The irony, not known until after the war, was that Germany never came close to building atomic bombs. German atomic research had been abandoned in early 1942 after scientists calculated that weapons development would require resources Germany could not spare from conventional arms production. The scientific knowledge, engineering expertise, and industrial infrastructure required for the Manhattan Project existed nowhere else in the world. Britain had excellent scientists, but lacked industrial resources. The Soviet Union had brilliant theoreticians, but lacked the technological base. Germany had started ahead, but abandoned the effort. Japan had some of the world's best physicists, but lacked uranium, industrial capacity, and the organizational resources for a program of necessary scale. Only America possessed all required elements: scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, electrical power, rare materials, engineering expertise, financial resources, and above all, the organizational capability to coordinate efforts across dozens of sites involving hundreds of companies and over 130,000 workers. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, used uranium-235 and detonated with force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion killed approximately 70 to 80,000 people immediately and destroyed 4 square miles of the city. Tens of thousands more would die in subsequent weeks and months from radiation exposure and burns. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, used plutonium and detonated with slightly greater force, approximately 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The explosion killed approximately 40 to 60,000 people, immediately in a city partially shielded by hills that limited blast effects. These attacks demonstrated conclusively that Japan could no longer protect its population from American assault. Emperor Hirohito, speaking publicly for the first time in Japanese history, announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. In his radio address, he cited the atomic bombs specifically as justification for surrender, stating that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, ending the Pacific War. The strategic analysis of Japan's defeat reveals that Pearl Harbor, far from being Japan's greatest victory, was actually the trigger for inevitable collapse. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this truth before the attack. His prediction of 6 months of success, followed by mounting difficulties, proved accurate almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, June 4th to 7th, precisely matching Yamamoto's timeline. From that moment forward, American industrial capacity made Japanese defeat mathematically certain regardless of courage, skill, or sacrifice displayed by Japanese forces. Japanese military planners had made several catastrophic miscalculations, each one compounding the others to create strategic disaster. First, they underestimated American industrial capacity by a factor of 10 or more. They knew America produced more than Japan, but fundamentally misunderstood the scale of potential American mobilization. Second, they assumed American society was too soft, too divided, too decadent to mobilize effectively for total war. They believed Americans loved comfort and would not accept sacrifices necessary for victory. Pearl Harbor proved them disastrously wrong, unifying American public opinion and creating determination to fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Third, Japanese planners believed military excellence could compensate for material inferiority. They assumed superior training, fighting spirit, and tactical skill would allow Japanese forces to achieve victory despite inferior numbers. This assumption ignored the mathematics of attrition warfare. Superior training matters in individual combat, but in industrial warfare involving millions of soldiers and tens of thousands of aircraft and ships, quantity has its own quality. American forces could accept losses, learn from mistakes, and return with improved equipment and fresh troops. Japanese forces could not replace losses and watched numerical strength decline month after month. Fourth, Japanese planners gambled that America would negotiate peace after early defeats rather than fight to unconditional surrender. They believed American casualties at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and early battles would create public pressure for negotiated peace that would leave Japan controlling much of its conquered territory. They fundamentally misunderstood American political culture and the determination that Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had created. America fought to unconditional surrender, accepting whatever casualties proved necessary to achieve complete victory. They were wrong on every calculation, and each miscalculation was compounded by Japan's inability to adapt when reality contradicted assumptions. Japanese military leadership, trained in a culture that valued spirit over material considerations, could not accept that industrial production mattered more than fighting spirit. They continued launching offensives even when losses were unsustainable, believing determination would somehow overcome mathematical reality. American production statistics tell the story of systematic industrial mobilization that defeated Japan as surely as bombs and bullets. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, approximately 6,800 naval vessels. These numbers represent production achieved while simultaneously fighting Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa, maintaining civilian standards of living far above subsistence levels, and actually expanding the American economy overall. Between 1941 and 1945, American gross national product increased by approximately 70% while producing enough military equipment to supply not only American forces but also substantial Allied forces, including Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free French forces. Japan could not remotely approach this output even when devoting all resources to military production and accepting drastic civilian privation. By 1944, Japanese civilians were on subsistence rations. Cities were being evacuated to reduce food requirements. Industrial production was declining due to lack of raw materials as the American submarine blockade tightened. Yet American civilians enjoyed relative prosperity. Food remained abundant if rationed, consumer goods remained available if restricted, and American industrial output continued expanding. The human cost of the war was staggering and must be acknowledged even in a narrative focused on industrial production. Japan suffered approximately 2.1 to 2.5 million military deaths and 550,000 to 800,000 civilian deaths, with uncertainty due to incomplete records and ongoing debate about casualties from atomic bombings and firebombing. American casualties in the Pacific Theater were approximately 100,000 killed and 300,000 wounded. Significant numbers, but proportionally far smaller than Japanese losses. The disparity in casualties reflects the fundamental reality of the conflict. America could sustain losses and replace them with fresh troops, new equipment, and maintained morale. Japan could not. Every ship sunk, every plane shot down, every soldier killed represented irreplaceable loss for Japan, but temporary setback for America. By 1945, Japan was fielding inexperienced pilots with minimal training, operating damaged aircraft patched together from spare parts, burning alternative fuels made from pine tree roots because petroleum was unavailable. American forces were fielding better-trained pilots, flying superior aircraft, operating from secure bases with ample supplies. Post-war interviews with Japanese military leaders revealed the psychological impact of American production capacity. General Kawabe Torashiro, who served on the Imperial General Staff throughout the war, stated in post-war interrogations that Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial power. He acknowledged that Japan would have needed to increase industrial production 20-fold to match American output, something that was physically impossible given Japan's resource base, industrial technology, labor force, and geographic limitations. The strategic conclusion, he admitted decades after the war, when hindsight made everything clear, should have been obvious before the war began. America could not be defeated through military force because it possessed industrial capacity that made military victory mathematically impossible. Admiral Yamamoto had known this truth and tried desperately to communicate it to military and political leadership before the war began. He had lived in America from 1925 to 1925, studied at Harvard University, traveled extensively throughout the country, and served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He understood that American industrial capacity, once mobilized, would prove overwhelming. His famous 6-month prediction was not military analysis based on battle tactics or strategic positioning. It was industrial calculation based on cold mathematics. He knew Japanese forces could achieve tactical victories for approximately 6 months, the time required for American industry to mobilize fully and for the American military to absorb initial setbacks, learn lessons, and return with overwhelming force. After that point, American production would overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer material superiority, regardless of Japanese courage or tactical skill. His prediction proved accurate to the month, and his death, in April 1943, meant he did not live to see the complete vindication of his warnings or the utter devastation that his colleagues' refusal to listen had brought upon Japan. The legacy of American production during World War II extended far beyond military victory over Japan and Germany. The factories that built B-29 bombers converted to building commercial airliners, establishing American dominance in aerospace that continues today. The shipyards that launched Liberty ships built container vessels and tankers for global commerce. The industrial capacity mobilized for war production transitioned smoothly to peacetime prosperity, establishing America as the world's preeminent economic power for generations. That dominance began with production goals announced 30 days after Pearl Harbor and proved through achievements that exceeded Japan's worst fears. The workers, engineers, and managers who performed this industrial mobilization deserve recognition alongside soldiers who fought in combat zones. They demonstrated that modern warfare required total societal mobilization. That victory came from coordinated effort involving millions of people across entire nations, and that industrial production mattered as much as tactical excellence on battlefields. Women welding Liberty ship hulls in Richmond shipyards contributed as much to victory as Marines landing on beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Engineers designing production systems for rapid aircraft assembly were as important as fighter pilots achieving air superiority over Japanese cities. The entire American home front mobilized for production in ways that Japanese planners had calculated were impossible in a democratic society where citizens retained freedom and government power was limited. The story of Pearl Harbor's aftermath is fundamentally about industrial production, resource mobilization, and the triumph of systematic industrial capacity over tactical military excellence. Japan's military forces were superbly trained, tactically proficient, courageous beyond question, and willing to sacrifice everything for victory. Japanese pilots, sailors, and soldiers fought with skill and determination that commanded respect from their enemies. These qualities, as impressive as they were, proved insufficient against an opponent who produced weapons faster than they could be destroyed, ships faster than they could be sunk, and aircraft faster than they could be shot down. Modern warfare, as American production demonstrated conclusively, was decided in factories as much as on battlefields. The nation that could mobilize industry effectively, organize production efficiently, and sustain output indefinitely would defeat opponents regardless of tactical victories or individual heroism displayed in combat. This lesson, learned definitively in the Pacific War, would shape military thinking for generations and drive Cold War competition between America and the Soviet Union in following decades. Today, historians assess Pearl Harbor as one of history's greatest strategic miscalculations, a decision that doomed the nation that made it. Japan attacked an opponent with more than 10 times their industrial capacity, believing that military excellence, fighting spirit, and tactical surprise could overcome material inferiority. They gambled that America would negotiate peace after early defeats rather than mobilize fully and fight to unconditional surrender. They assumed American society was too divided, too soft, too focused on individual comfort to accept sacrifices necessary for total war. They were wrong on every calculation, and the cost of those miscalculations was complete defeat, occupation, atomic bombing, loss of empire, and fundamental transformation of Japanese society and government. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway demonstrated the speed and completeness of American mobilization. The remaining 3.5 years of war demonstrated the inevitability of American victory once that mobilization achieved full strength and American production reached levels that Japan could neither match nor effectively resist. Roosevelt's production goals, announced 30 days after Pearl Harbor in his State of the Union address, and initially dismissed by Japanese intelligence as propaganda designed for American morale, were largely achieved or exceeded when considered across the 2-year time frame Roosevelt had specified. 60,000 aircraft in 1942 became 47,000, falling short but still nearly 10 times Japanese annual output. 125,000 aircraft in 1943 became 85,000, missing the target but still dwarfing enemy production and representing more aircraft than existed in the entire world a decade earlier. The tank goals were met or exceeded across the 2-year period. 45,000 tanks in 1942 plus 75,000 in 1943, totaling 120,000, was approximately achieved, with American factories ultimately producing 86,000 tanks during the entire war. The shipping goals were exceeded dramatically, with American shipyards launching far more tonnage than Roosevelt had requested. The anti-aircraft gun production met or exceeded targets. The story of Japanese expectations versus American industrial reality stands as enduring testament to the danger of misunderstanding your opponent's capabilities, of making strategic decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, and of believing what you wish were true rather than accepting reality. Japan's military planners made calculations based on incomplete information, cultural assumptions that proved false, systematic underestimation of American resolve, and strategic wishful thinking that ignored contrary evidence. They believed what they wanted to believe, what fit their preconceptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority, rather than conducting cold mathematical analysis of relative industrial capacity and strategic resources. Admiral Yamamoto, who had lived in America and understood American industrial capacity firsthand, tried desperately to warn them. His warnings were ignored, dismissed as defeatism, treated as lack of fighting spirit. The result was catastrophic defeat, occupation by foreign forces for the first time in Japanese history, atomic bombing, loss of empire, and complete transformation of Japanese government and society. The magnitude of American achievement becomes overwhelmingly clear when examining complete production statistics across all categories. America built 297,000 aircraft while fighting on multiple continents and oceans. Japan built 85,611 aircraft while focusing primarily on one theater. America produced 86,000 tanks. Japan built approximately 6,500. America launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels. Japan completed fewer than 1,000. In every single category of military production, in every measure of industrial output, in every comparison of war-making capacity, the disparity was overwhelming, sustained across 4 years, and ultimately decisive in determining war outcomes. The final verdict on Pearl Harbor's strategic value comes from Japanese sources themselves, from the officers and leaders who planned and executed the attack and lived to see its consequences. Admiral Yamamoto, before his death on April 18, 1943, when his aircraft was shot down by P-38 Lightning fighters flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in an ambush enabled by code breaking, had written privately that the attack had been a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It destroyed battleships, impressive targets that made good propaganda, but were increasingly obsolete in carrier warfare, while missing the carriers that would prove decisive. It unified American public opinion, which had been divided between interventionists and isolationists, creating national consensus for total war that might have been impossible to achieve through normal political processes. It guaranteed American entry into war with fury and determination rather than reluctant participation that Japan might have managed through diplomatic means. Most fatally, it awakened American industrial capacity, mobilized American society completely, and triggered the transformation that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power and enable Japanese victory instead guaranteed Japanese defeat by mobilizing an opponent whose industrial capacity, once aroused, proved unstoppable. By striking Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack that Americans perceived as treacherous and dishonorable, Japan triggered the most rapid and complete industrial mobilization in human history. The transformation occurred because American industrial capacity, which Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood and systematically underestimated, mobilized with unprecedented speed, achieved unprecedented scale, and operated with unprecedented efficiency. The workers in American factories won the Pacific War, as certainly as soldiers in combat zones. The women welding bomber fuselages, the men casting tank armor, the engineers optimizing production lines, the managers coordinating supply chains, Every person who contributed to American industrial output from December 1941 through August 1945 helped defeat Japan. The industrial might that shocked Japanese observers and convinced them of inevitable defeat was not propaganda, not exaggeration, not temporary achievement. It was mathematics, cold calculation, systematic mobilization of resources and capabilities that Japan could never match, and it rewrote the strategic balance of the Pacific War in 6 transformative months from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942, demonstrating conclusively that modern warfare would be won by industrial capacity as much as military skill, that production mattered as much as tactics, and that nations attacking opponents with vastly superior industrial resources did so at risk of complete destruction. The transformation of American society during this period deserves deeper examination because it represents perhaps history's most complete example of democratic mobilization for total war. Unlike authoritarian regimes that could command sacrifice through force, American mobilization occurred through voluntary participation, economic incentives, patriotic appeals, and social pressure. Defense workers earned good wages, often better than pre-war employment. Women entering factories gained economic independence along with patriotic purpose. African Americans found opportunities previously denied them. The mobilization succeeded not through coercion, but through aligning individual interests with national goals. The War Production Board under Donald Nelson, succeeded by Julius Krug in 1944, coordinated industrial mobilization with remarkable effectiveness considering the scale and complexity of the task. The board allocated scarce materials, set production priorities, resolved conflicts between competing demands, and ensured that production facilities operated at maximum capacity. The board's work represented economic planning on scales previously attempted only by totalitarian governments. Yet it operated within democratic constraints, responding to political pressures, negotiating with industry leaders, and maintaining public support. The achievement becomes even more remarkable when considering the obstacles overcome. American industry in 1941 was not prepared for war production. Factories designed for civilian goods required extensive retooling. Workers needed training for unfamiliar tasks. Supply chains had to be reorganized. Management systems developed for peacetime production proved inadequate for wartime demands. Yet within months, American industry transformed itself completely, achieving production levels that Japanese observers found literally incredible even when confronted with evidence. The speed of transformation exceeded anything Japanese planners had considered possible. In their calculations of American industrial potential, Japanese analysts had assumed that democratic societies with competing interests and limited government power would mobilize slowly and incompletely. They assumed labor disputes would disrupt production, that racial tensions would undermine cooperation, that political divisions would prevent unified action. The unity and speed of American mobilization after Pearl Harbor shattered these assumptions completely. Consider the social implications of this mobilization. Women entering factories in massive numbers challenged traditional gender roles and demonstrated capabilities that pre-war society had denied or ignored. African Americans gaining industrial employment and military service challenged racial segregation and planted seeds for civil rights movements that would transform American society in following decades. The shared experience of war mobilization, of working toward common goals, of sacrificing for collective good, strengthened American national identity and demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize as effectively as authoritarian regimes without sacrificing fundamental freedoms. The Japanese military leadership's fundamental misunderstanding of American society contributed directly to strategic defeat. They believed democracy was weakness, that freedom meant decadence, that individualism prevented collective action. Pearl Harbor proved them catastrophically wrong. American democracy, aroused to fury by surprise attack, mobilized more completely and effectively than Japanese authoritarianism. American individualism, channeled toward national purpose, achieved more than Japanese conformity. American diversity, drawing upon talents and energies of every group in society, outproduced Japanese homogeneity. The lessons extended beyond World War II, shaping Cold War competition and influencing military thinking for generations. The nation that could mobilize industrial capacity most effectively, that could organize production most efficiently, that could sustain output most reliably, would possess decisive advantages in prolonged conflicts. This understanding drove Cold War arms races, space competition, and technological development. The pattern established in the Pacific War, where American industrial capacity proved decisive, repeated in Cold War competition, where American economic strength ultimately exceeded Soviet capacity, despite Soviet advantages in some military technologies. The human stories behind the statistics deserve remembrance. The teenage girl from Iowa who left high school to weld Liberty ship hulls, earning wages that supported her family and discovering capabilities she had never suspected. The African-American man from Mississippi who migrated to Detroit and found factory work that paid 3 times what he had earned as a sharecropper, experiencing for the first time what economic opportunity felt like. The grandmother from Oregon who came out of retirement to inspect aircraft parts, bringing decades of experience to quality control that ensured American pilots flew safe aircraft. These individuals, multiplied by millions across America, transformed their nation and changed world history. They were not soldiers, did not fire weapons, never saw combat. Yet their contributions were as essential to victory as any battle won, any island captured, any enemy defeated in combat. They proved that modern warfare required total societal mobilization, that civilians mattered as much as soldiers, that home front was as important as battlefront. The legacy of their achievement extends to present day. The industrial base they built supported American prosperity for generations. The social changes they initiated, particularly regarding women's roles and racial equality, transformed American society fundamentally. The demonstration that democratic societies could mobilize effectively provided ideological foundation for Cold War competition and continues influencing debates about governance and social organization. Japan learned these lessons through catastrophic defeat, through occupation, through fundamental transformation of society and government. The Japan that rose from defeat became one of the world's most successful democracies and industrial powers, building prosperity through peaceful competition rather than military conquest. This transformation occurred partly because Japanese leaders who survived the war understood what had defeated them. They had witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand. They understood that prosperity came from production, not conquest, from cooperation, not coercion, from freedom, not authoritarianism. The world learned these lessons by watching American industry transform warfare itself, establishing patterns and principles that would shape military competition for generations and define the nature of great power conflict in the industrial age. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway proved that surprise attacks and tactical brilliance were insufficient against opponents possessing overwhelming industrial advantages. The remaining years of war proved that once mobilized, American industrial capacity could sustain military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously while maintaining civilian prosperity, something no other nation achieved during World War II. The final measure of American achievement appears in comparative statistics across all combatants. America produced approximately 40% of all military equipment manufactured by all nations during World War II, despite comprising only 6% of world population. This ratio of production to population, sustained across 4 years of maximum effort, exceeded anything achieved in human history and demonstrated conclusively that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources as effectively as any authoritarian system while maintaining political freedom and improving civilian standards of living. The industrial mobilization that defeated Japan continues teaching lessons about national power, societal resilience, and the sources of strength in modern competition between nations. Physical courage matters, tactical skill matters, strategic intelligence matters, but in prolonged conflicts between industrial powers, production capacity matters most. The nation that can build more, build faster, build better, will eventually overwhelm opponents regardless of temporary tactical setbacks or individual heroism displayed in combat. Admiral Yamamoto understood this truth and tried to warn his nation. His warnings were ignored with catastrophic results. The attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power and enable Japanese victory, instead aroused American industrial might and guaranteed Japanese defeat. The 6 months from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942 saw American production accelerate from peacetime to wartime levels with unprecedented speed. The numbers tell a story of systematic mobilization that overwhelmed Japanese capacity completely. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, American factories were already retooling for war production. By February, automobile production had ceased entirely. By March, aircraft production was accelerating noticeably. By April, shipyards were launching vessels at unprecedented rates. By May, the Battle of Coral Sea demonstrated that American naval power was recovering rapidly. By June, at Midway, American forces delivered a blow from which Japan would never recover. Each month brought new evidence of American industrial power mobilizing effectively. Each month saw production figures exceed previous records. Each month demonstrated that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible production goals were becoming reality. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring American production through various sources, struggled to believe their own reports. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they were real, verified, undeniable. The following 3 years saw that production sustained and expanded until victory was achieved completely, unconditionally, and irreversibly. American Forces Island hopped across the Pacific, each operation supported by overwhelming material superiority. American submarines strangled Japanese commerce, enabled by production that replaced lost submarines faster than Japan could sink them. American aircraft dominated Pacific skies, shooting down Japanese planes in lopsided ratios that reflected both superior training and vastly superior numbers. By 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless by any objective measure. Cities burned from strategic bombing. The merchant marine was destroyed. Industrial production had collapsed. Food shortages approached starvation levels. Military forces fought with obsolete equipment, inadequate supplies, and dwindling numbers. Yet Japanese leadership refused to surrender until atomic bombs demonstrated that America possessed weapons against which no defense existed, and that continuation of war meant national annihilation. The contrast between Japanese expectations in December 1941 and Japanese reality in August 1945 could hardly be more stark. Japan began the war expecting quick victories, territorial gains, and negotiated peace that would leave the empire intact and powerful. Japan ended the war with cities destroyed, empire lost, military defeated, and nation occupied by foreign forces for the first time in recorded history. The transformation from confident aggressor to defeated and occupied nation occurred in less than 4 years, driven primarily by American industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese worst fears and proved impossible to resist or overcome. This transformation, this complete reversal of fortune, this total defeat of an opponent that had seemed unstoppable in early 1942, resulted from American industrial mobilization that began in response to Pearl Harbor and achieved levels of production that rewrote strategic calculations. The Pacific War, despite its many battles, its countless acts of heroism, its technological innovations, and its tactical complexities, was ultimately decided by industrial capacity. America possessed it, Japan did not. That difference was decisive, determinative, and ultimately overwhelming, transforming the Pacific region, establishing American dominance that persisted for generations, and demonstrating conclusively that modern warfare would be won in factories as certainly as on battlefields,